Dr. Craig, we're continuing to look at science and philosophy, science and religion, and this topic continues to be everywhere. So let's keep talking about it. And Neil deGrasse Tyson is one of the more popular spokesmen today on science and popular science. He writes in the Huffington Post, "You can't bend science to suit religious or cultural mores. If you cherry pick scientific truths to serve cultural, economic, religious, or political objectives, you undermine the foundations of an informed democracy." He says science distinguishes itself from all other branches of human pursuit by its power to probe and understand the behavior of nature on a level that allows us to predict with accuracy, if not control, the outcomes of events in the natural world.
Now, what that is to say is simply that science has limits. I'm not sure he appreciates that that is what he's saying, but it means that science is a human endeavor aimed at probing and understanding the behavior of the natural world in such a way as to enable us to predict, if not control, events in the natural world. And I think he's quite right that you don't want to cherry pick scientific truths in order to serve cultural, economic, religious, or political objectives. But that isn't to say that science isn't itself shaped by wider worldviews, metaphysical worldviews, perhaps even religious worldviews, and is conducted within the conceptual framework of those sorts of worldviews. Or that there is not knowledge that is available through other methods of human endeavor than science.
He says the scientific method which underpins these achievements can be summarized in one sentence, which is all about objectivity. Do whatever it takes to avoid fooling yourself into thinking something is true that is not, or that something is not true that is. Knowing what I know about Dr. Tyson here, he's saying, don't believe anything religious, you know.
Well, it's amazing that he thinks that this simple sentence could summarize the scientific method. He's just saying, don't fool yourself.
The sword cuts all over the place there.
Right. Don't think something's true if it's not, and don't think that something is false if it is true. That hardly summarizes the scientific method. Indeed, the advice to look for objective truth is universal across human endeavors and not just in science. Astonishingly, Kevin, in the next paragraph, he goes on to say that this approach to knowing did not take root until the early 17th century. That's simply astonishing, as though, for example, Aristotle did not follow this sort of advice. In fact, Aristotle said, in characterizing what is true, something very similar to deGrasse Tyson's aphorism here. Aristotle said, to assert of something that it is true, while to assert of something that is not, that it is false. Well, that's very similar to what deGrasse Tyson says, and Aristotle would agree. You shouldn't fool yourself into thinking that something is true if it's false, or that something is false if it's true. This is hardly a discovery of the 17th century.
Yeah, obviously we knew before the 17th century some of these things, but let's be generous and see if he's talking about maybe a particular scientific method, because he says, shortly after the inventions of both the microscope and the telescope, the astronomer Galileo and philosopher Sir Francis Bacon agreed, conduct experiments to test your hypothesis and allocate your confidence in proportion to the strength of your evidence. Again, I'm sure that there are scientists and philosophers before the 17th century who recognized that. It's kind of a truism, isn't it?
Yes, and again, if he is talking here about the experimental method, well, that's fine, but that's not what his sentence summarizing the scientific method said. In other words, he's now here departing from his own definition of what is supposedly the scientific method.
Yeah. And he heralds something that is supposed to be one of the hallmarks of science. You hear it all the time. Science is something that is peer-reviewed. Science has kind of a self-regulating system. He says, this internal self-regulating system within science may be unique among professions, and it does not require the public or the press or politicians to make it work. But watching the machinery operate may nonetheless fascinate you. Just observe the flow of research papers that grace the pages of peer-reviewed scientific journal. This breeding ground of discovery is also, on occasion, a battlefield where scientific controversy is laid bare. Well, checks and balances, but it's certainly not the only.
Review,
yeah.
that's hardly unique to the natural sciences.
No, I mean, yeah, I mean, it's not just unique to that.
No.
Science discovers objective truths. These are not established by any seated authority, nor by any single research paper.
And then he goes on to say, the press, the popular press, in an effort to break a story, may mislead the public's awareness of how science works by headlining a just published scientific paper as the truth, perhaps also touting the academic pedigree of the authors. Now, I like that point that he's making there.
Yeah.
I recently saw an article in a British newspaper about how physicists have now disproved the creation of the universe by God by some newly published scientific paper. And they do exactly what Tyson said. Here was a new model. When you read the story, it actually didn't do anything like it was supposed to. In fact, I think this got an award from some online group that gives awards to bad headlines, bad press. It was so ridiculous. But this is a failure of the popular press, is rather than waiting for scientific consensus to emerge and for the process of peer review and so forth to take place, it loves to talk about the most recent development in science, the most recent paper, as though this has discovered some new truth that upends the apple cart of science. And that, I think, we need to be very, very aware of and very skeptical of.
Yeah. Don't just read the headline. The headline can be very
And do not
misleading.
go on the basis of just a single published report. Wait, be patient, wait, and let the theory be submitted to criticism by others before you jump on the bandwagon.
He says, once an objective truth is established by these methods, it is not later found to be false.
Now that's a surprising statement. Does he think that theories that were once the scientific consensus have not been overthrown? I'm astonished that he would think that. Of course they have. There have been scientific theories that represented the consensus view in the past, and then subsequent developments of science have overthrown those. One example, of course, would be Newton's physics, which have now been superseded by relativity theory. Now, he protests this by saying that the era of modern physics did not discard Newton's laws of motion and gravity. What it did was describe deeper realities of nature, made visible by ever greater methods and tools of inquiry. Modern physics enclosed classical physics as a special case of these larger truths. Well, now, he's making a good point there. It's not as though a scientific revolution simply discards the theory of the past. Usually what it will do will set limits within which the earlier theory is still valid and can be used, but it is no longer taken to be the truth about the way reality is. It will be restricted or limited in a certain way, and in that sense, those former beliefs have come to be discarded. But the truths that were embodied in those earlier theories will be preserved and taken up into the new theories. But it's simply not the case that just because a statement or view is established as a scientific consensus, that it will no longer be found to be false. In fact, Kevin, we know that the two pillars of modern physics, relativity theory and quantum theory, are false, that they will be found to be false because they're incompatible with each other. The twin pillars of modern physics have not been united with each other, and so some modification of these theories is going to have to take place in order to unite relativity theory and quantum theory into a single theory. So even though these theories do represent the consensus of science today and have been confirmed individually to enormous precision, nevertheless, we know that these theories will be superseded.
Okay. And so, Bill, he's heralding the glory of objective truth and discovering objective truth, the checks and balances, peer review of the scientific method to get there. Then he goes on to say, meanwhile, personal truths are what you may hold dear but have no real way of convincing others who disagree, except by heated argument, coercion, or by force. These are the foundation of most people's opinions. Is Jesus your Savior? Is Muhammad God's last prophet on earth? Should the government support poor people? Is Beyonce a cultural queen? Kirk or Picard? Star Trek reference there. Mm-hmm. Differences in opinion define the cultural diversity of a nation and should be cherished in any free society.
Well, now, I think there, Kevin, he is opposing these personal truths to scientific truths, and he seems to be suggesting that in contrast to scientific truths, these personal truths cannot be adjudicated. And if, by implication, he's suggesting that this is the nature of religious truths, then I would disagree with him that these are not susceptible to adjudication. I think you can give good grounds for thinking that the Gospels are historically reliable in what they say about Jesus of Nazareth, that by contrast, Muhammad was not a prophet of God because he said many things that were untrue. So I would say that these other non-scientific forms of truth are also susceptible to adjudication through rational methods of argument and evidence.
Yeah. You know, to distinguish between objective truth and personal truth just seems to be kind of inaccurate. I mean, if it's true, right? You know, I mean, you don't have a false truism.
No.
I mean, you know.
Instead of, well, personal truths, I was going to say subjective, or maybe person relative, and maybe that's what he means by personal truths. I took him to mean existential truths. He says personal truths are what you hold dear, but have no way of convincing others. But maybe he means person relative truths, like statements of taste, that vanilla tastes good is person relative. Or I don't like ice hockey, say that's a person relative truth, not an objective truth. But I think that the implication or the subtext is that science discovers objective truth, and the rest of these things are just person relative truths, not really objective, and therefore just a matter of opinion.
And science discovers objective truth about the natural world.
Well, yes, and we can agree with that. Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
The question is, are there ways of knowing about other things like ethics and metaphysics and aesthetics that don't involve the natural world and that are capable of being known?
Okay. Well, let's continue with another article that happens to mention Neil deGrasse Tyson, Bill. And this is another article in Scientific American where John Horgan interviews Carlo Rovelli, Rovelli is an author of a leading textbook on quantum gravity. And he talks about the philosophy of guessing has harmed physics. Now, we'll get into that, but there is one thing that he says here. Horgan asks him, what's your opinion of the recent philosophy bashing by Stephen Hawking, Lawrence Krauss, and Neil deGrasse Tyson, whom we just read? Rovelli says, seriously, I think they are stupid in this. So there's the harsh word. He says, I have admiration for them in other things, but here they have gone really wrong. Look, Einstein, Heisenberg, Newton, Bohr, and many others are the greatest scientists of all time, much greater than the names you mentioned. Of course, read philosophy, learned from philosophy, and could have never done the great science they did without the input they got from philosophy, and they claimed that repeatedly. You see, scientists that talk philosophy down are simply superficial. They have a philosophy, usually some ill-digested mixture of Popper and Kuhn, he says, and think that this is the true philosophy, and do not realize that this has its limitations.
Yes, I love that response. In response to people like Hawking, Krauss, and Tyson, he says that philosophy has been a vital part of the greatest scientific work that has been done, that they could not have done the great science they did without the input they got from philosophy. That's an astonishing statement. And then goes on to point out that these fellows themselves actually have a philosophy of their own, but they're probably usually not very well aware of it. It's probably superficial, so that they really are pulling the rug out from under themselves. The fact is that philosophy is very vital and helpful to science in providing things like conceptual clarity, definitions of key concepts, and understanding logical connections, assumptions, and presuppositions. In all of these ways, philosophy can help the task of science. A great example of this would be with regard to people like Krauss and Hawking's use of the word nothing as a term referring to something, when in fact the word nothing is just a term of universal negation, meaning not anything. And they're misusing the term and the concept of nothing and arriving at quite wrong conclusions. And
I had nothing for lunch, and it tasted just like chicken.
Right. Yes.
Yeah.
And similarly, people like deGrasse Tyson's epistemology that they adopt, that's going to be a philosophical stance that they take about the nature of knowledge, the nature of truth, and it needs to be philosophically examined. It isn't enough to just assume it and then to trash philosophy as though you don't have one.
Here's the main part of this article. Rovelli gives an example here of this philosophical superficiality. He says, here's an example. Theoretical physics has not done great in the last decades. Why? Well, one of the reasons I think is that it got trapped in a wrong philosophy. The idea that you can make progress by guessing new theory and disregarding the qualitative content of previous theories. This is the physics of the why not? Why not studying this theory or the other? Why not another dimension, another field, another universe? Science has never advanced in this manner in the past. Science does not advance by guessing. It advances by new data or by a deep investigation of the content and the apparent contradictions of previous empirically successful theories. Quite remarkably, the best piece of physics done by the three people you mentioned is Hawking's black hole radiation, which is exactly this. But most of current theoretical physics is not of this sort. Why? Largely because of the philosophical superficiality of the current bunch of scientists.
Wow, those are powerful words. And I have seen this why not attitude that he describes exhibited by certain quantum physicists, where they will actually assert that if it's not impossible, then it's actual. So that if this is permitted by quantum theory say, then it actually exists. This sort of why not have another dimension, another field, or something of that sort. And Rovelli says that this has been sterile in terms of the advancement of science. George Ellis has similarly criticized contemporary multiverse theories and other speculative theories of the origin of the universe as also being too detached from experimental data, testable hypotheses, and having this sort of why not attitude based on sheer possibility.
Yeah, it's like he's calling for some restraint, maybe some conservatism here. Just because the latest theory is exotic, the latest exotic there or the latest sexy theory, to use modern terminology. Some theories perhaps aren't sexy enough, so we have to come up with multiverses and things like that. He seems to say that string theory has gone in this direction, that once that was the darling and now it's kind of kaput.
Yeah, it's not lived up to its promises according to the physicists that I've read. It has disappointed.
Well, let's wrap up today and look a little bit about what Rovelli says about belief in God. Horgan asked him, do you believe in God? He goes, no, but perhaps I should qualify the answer because like this, it is a bit too rude and simplistic. I do not understand what to believe in God means. The people that believe in God seem like Martians to me. I do not understand them. I suppose this means that I do not believe in God. If the question is whether I think there is a person who created heavens and earth and responds to our prayers, then definitely my answer is no with much certainty.
Yeah, I'm a little surprised at his answer here, that he claims not to understand theists and that they're like aliens to him. Apparently he's not encountered many theists in his discipline or in his work with other scientists. But I think the question is rightly framed, do you believe that there is a personal being who has created the universe, who answers our prayers? He says he doesn't believe in such a thing. I think that's unfortunate. I think there are good reasons to believe that such a being exists. But I think that at least is a clear understanding of the question that he claims that he finds it difficult to understand.
Well, Bill, I would hope that Rovelli would encounter some theist who could discuss these things with him on his level and in his field. I think he would find some fascinating things and might answer some of the questions that he has. How do you reach somebody like Rovelli, though, and get to him?
Well, I do think you're right, Kevin, that it would be most effective through his own peers. Those who are Christians and working in the fields of natural science need to be lights in those fields. They need to do first-rate scientific work, but then also be ready to share the reason for the hope that is in them when they have opportunity.